They watched the Duke ride home in the gray hour before the sun found the chimneys, mud to his knees and his collar undone, and by the time the milk was set to skim, they had married him twice over to a woman none of them had ever seen. Eleanor Hartley heard it first from the scullery doorway, a basin of eggs balanced on her hip, and she did not set the basin down. Because a woman who set things down when gossip started was a woman inviting more of it. She did not yet know that the woman they had invented out of mud and moonlight did not exist, or that the truth wearing her face would very nearly cost the Duke everything he owned, herself not excepted from the reckoning. She would know it before the leaves turned. She would wish, afterward, that she had spoken sooner than she did. "Fourth morning this fortnight," said the under-housemaid, whose name was Patience, and whose gift for arithmetic began and ended at counting other people's sins. "Rides out before the cock, rides back with his boots soaked through, and never a word to a living soul where he's been. Perhaps he walks in his sleep," said Eleanor, setting the eggs at last upon the table, because a woman could only hold her tongue so long before holding a basin became the harder task. "Perhaps he swims." "Perhaps," said Patience, with the particular relish of a woman who has already decided the answer and only wants an audience to agree with her, he keeps a woman out past Hollow Beck and pays for her keeping out of accounts nobody's meant to see. The kitchen went quiet the way kitchens go quiet, when a thing has been said that everyone half believed, and no one wished to be first to say aloud. Eleanor felt the old, familiar tightening behind her ribs, the one that came whenever a man who had never done her a discourtesy was being taken apart by people who had never done him a kindness either, and she did what she always did with that tightening, which was to fold it very small and put it somewhere it would not show on her face. She was 26, and poor, and a poor relation besides, which in that house meant she was permitted to hear everything and repeat nothing, an arrangement she had always privately thought unfair to the person doing the hearing. She had come to Alderley 3 years before as companion to the Duke's sister, on the strength of a dead father's good name and a living aunt's persistence. And she had stayed because she was useful, and she had made herself indispensable at figures, because a woman who could be sent away for being merely pleasant could not so easily be sent away for being correct. In 6 weeks the trustees would sit for the Michaelmas audit. The first since the old Duke's death had left the young one holding an estate he had not been raised to inherit. And Lady Iris had already sent out invitations for the ball that would follow it, the first the house had held in 3 years of mourning black. Every soul under that roof understood, without needing to be told twice, that whatever was true of the young Duke by Michaelmas had better be settled truth, because a man who could not account for his rents, and could not account for a woman with no name, was not a man any sensible family would hand a daughter to, however many acres came with him. "He'll ruin himself before he ruins her, whoever she is," said Patience, with the satisfaction of a prophet who expects to be proven right, and rather hopes she will be. "Mark it." Eleanor marked nothing aloud. She carried the eggs through to the still-room, and it was there, with her back to the door and her hands full, that she heard the door itself open behind her, and a voice she knew at once, low and unhurried, say her name as though he had been standing in the doorway rather longer than she would have liked. "Miss Hartley." She turned. The Duke of Alderley stood on the threshold in the same boots Patience had counted, mud to the ankle, his coat over his arm rather than his shoulders, looking like a man who had ridden a very long way to arrive somewhere he did not particularly wish to be found. He had his father's height and none of his father's ease in a room. He stood the way a man stands, who has learned that stillness costs less than movement, that a still man gives less away. "Your Grace." She set the basin down at last, because there are moments when a woman must choose between two disciplines, and she chose the one that let her face him plainly. "I did not hear you come in." "No," he said. "I imagine you did not." There was nothing in his voice to tell her how much of the kitchen's conversation had followed him up the passage, and everything in his stillness to tell her that some of it had. He looked at her for a moment longer than courtesy required, the way a man looks at a ledger column that will not balance, and then he said, in the same unhurried voice, "I understand you keep good figures." "I keep honest ones, Your Grace. They are not always the same thing as good." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, and did not stay long enough to become one. "Come to my study within the hour," he said. "I find I am in want of an honest pair of eyes rather sooner than I expected to be." And he was gone before she could ask him why, leaving the door to swing on its hinge and the whole kitchen, she was quite certain, holding its breath behind her. She went up within the half hour rather than the hour, because a woman who has been summoned by a duke does not improve her position by keeping him waiting to prove she is not eager. And because she had spent 3 years learning that Julian Vane, Duke of Alderley, said exactly what he meant, and rarely troubled himself to say it twice. His study smelled of leather and rain-damp wool and the cold ash of a fire let die sometime after midnight, and he was standing at the window with his back to the door when she entered, turning something between his fingers that she would come, in time to recognize as his father's signet ring, worn on a chain rather than a hand too large for it yet. "Sit," he said, without turning. "I do not bite, whatever the kitchen may have told you of my habits. The kitchen tells me a great many things, Your Grace. I make it a policy to believe perhaps a third of them. A generous third or a stingy one? That depends entirely on what they are saying about you." He did turn then, and the almost smile came back, briefer than the first. "My steward left me 3 ledgers in a hand I cannot read, and a 4th he swears does not exist, and the trustees sit in 6 weeks to ask me questions I cannot yet answer. I am told you kept your father's books before you kept anyone's affection, and that you have not once in 3 years been caught in an error. I have been caught in several. I correct them before anyone thinks to look. That," he said, "is precisely the quality I require." He set a stack of ledgers on the desk between them, bound in cracked brown leather, the ink within faded to the color of weak tea, and did not sit himself, but stood over them the way a man stands over a grave he is not yet ready to fill in. "I will pay you for the work as I would pay any clerk, and I will expect you to say nothing of what you find until I have said it first. Those are my terms, and if what I find is not to your liking, then you will tell me so plainly the way you have just told me you believe only a third of what the kitchen says of me." He looked at her with something that was not quite challenge and not quite appeal. "I have had a surfeit, these 3 years, of people who tell me what they think I wish to hear. I find I have developed rather a hunger for the alternative." "Then you have hired the right clerk, Your Grace," said Eleanor, drawing the first ledger toward her, "for I have never once in my life managed to tell a comfortable lie." He almost laughed at that. She saw it reach as far as his eyes before he caught it back, the way a man catches a coin before it rings on stone, and something in her chest, foolishly, marked the moment down, though she could not yet have said why it seemed worth marking. Mrs. Pruitt, who had kept house at Alderley since before the old Duke's marriage and considered herself answerable to God, the Dowager's memory, and no one currently living in that order, found Eleanor an hour later still bent over the ledgers, and set down a cup of tea she had not been asked for, with the particular thump of a woman who intends the thump to be noticed. "So he's given you the books," she said. It was not a question. "He has." and you'll find what everyone in this house already half suspects, and none of us dares say above a whisper, which is that Mr. Coldbrook keeps the accounts the way a fox keeps hens, tidy, right up until you count them." Eleanor looked up. "You think ill of the steward. I think the steward has never once, in 11 years, allowed a figure to sit still long enough for an honest woman to add it twice and get the same answer." Mrs. Pruitt folded her arms, keys chiming faintly at her waist, a sound Eleanor had come to associate so entirely with the housekeeper's opinions that she sometimes thought she could hear disapproval in the jingle before the words arrived. "But that is a thing you'll find on your own, or you'll find nothing, because I've said more to you this minute than I've said to any soul in a decade, and I'll deny every word of it before a magistrate. Then I shall have to find it on my own." "You will," said Mrs. Pruitt, softening by exactly 1 degree, the way ice softens at the very edge of a pond in a thaw that has not yet reached the middle. "You've your father's eye for it. God rest him. Whatever else the world took from you for his sake, it was as close as anyone in that house had come, in 3 years, to naming aloud what everyone knew, and no one troubled to say to Eleanor's face that her father had been a bookkeeper of great skill and greater trust, until a partner's theft had been laid at his door for want of anyone else convenient to blame, and that he had died with his name unmended and his daughter's prospects mended into. Nothing at all. She had built her whole adult life on the conviction that a column of figures, honestly kept, could not be argued with the way a reputation could, and she had come to Alderley with that conviction wrapped around her like a second, sturdier coat. "The books always balance, in the end," she said now, half to herself, "the way one repeats an inherited prayer." That was his saying, my father's. He said a lie might survive a magistrate, or a whisper, or even a jury, but it could never survive an honest reconciliation of the sums, because sums do not care whom they flatter. "Then you'd best get reconciling," said Mrs. Pruitt, "for I doubt Mr. Coldbrook will thank you for the exercise." She was not wrong. Mr. Simon Coldbrook found Eleanor at the Ledgers 2 days later, and he found her, as he found most things, without appearing to have hunted for her at all. He was a handsome man in the particular way of a room that has been swept until no dust remains to prove it was ever dirty. His cravat pinned with a small gold pin he touched now and again, as another man might touch a rosary. His voice pitched low and pleasant even when, especially when, the thing he said was not pleasant in the least. "Miss Hartley." "I confess I am surprised to find His Grace's cousin's ledgers in a stranger's hands, and a lady's besides." "I am hardly a stranger, Mr. Coldbrook. I have kept this house's mending accounts for 3 years. Mending is a different discipline from managing, I find. One repairs what is torn. The other must decide, in advance, what may safely be spent." He drew a chair without being asked, and sat with the ease of a man who had never in his life doubted his welcome anywhere. "I would not have you waste your evenings on work I am paid and trained to do myself. Timber sales, rent rolls, the tenant arrears, these are dull figures, Miss Hartley. And duller still when a woman with a quicker gift might be spending her hours more pleasantly." "His Grace asked for my help." "His Grace," said Coldbrook, and touched the gold pin once, "is a man carrying a great many burdens just now, some of them not entirely of his own choosing, and I would not have you add to them by discovering some trifling error of mine and imagining it a mystery worth his worry. I have kept these books 11 years. They are not always elegant. They are not dishonest." He smiled, and the smile did not reach any further than his teeth. "I should hate for a misunderstanding between us to become a misunderstanding between you and the family that employs you both." It was not, in its wording, a threat. Eleanor had spent 3 years learning to hear the shape of a threat inside a courtesy the way one hears a stone inside a snowball before it strikes, and she heard it now, plainly enough that she did not trouble to pretend she had not. "I shall be careful then, Mr. Coldbrook, to make no mistakes of my own in reading them. I am sure you will," he said, and rose, and was gone, leaving behind him only the cold, clean smell of starch and lavender water, and one loose thread of unease that Eleanor did not manage to set down again for the rest of the evening. It was past midnight, working alone by a single candle, that she found the thread's other end, an entry in an older ledger, in a hand she did not recognize. Small and cramped, and pressed hard enough into the page to have torn it in one corner, recording a sale of standing timber from the northern coppice at a price so far beneath its worth that she read it 3 times to be certain her eyes had not tricked her, on a date she would later learn, though she did not yet know to look for it. That fell 2 days before a gamekeeper named Thomas Fenn had died in a shooting accident on his own master's land. She did not tell the Duke that night. She told herself she was not yet certain what she had found, which was true, and she told herself it could wait until morning, which was also true, and neither of those truths was the whole of why she said nothing. Because the whole of it was that she had liked very much the look on his face when he had almost laughed, and she was not yet ready to be the one who wiped it away. She brought him the coppice entry 3 evenings later, when the household had gone up to bed, and the study held only the 2 of them, and a fire built high against a late summer chill that had come in with the rain. He read it twice, the way she had, and set it down with a care that told her more than any exclamation could have. "This is Coldbrook's hand. It is not your Grace. That is what troubles me. It is someone else's hand, entered under his authority, in his ledger, for a sale that never appears in the timber factor's own account with the sum he claims to have received. You are telling me my steward has been selling my wood twice, once to the factor and once, invisibly, to himself. I am telling you the sums do not reconcile, and that a sum which does not reconcile is either an honest error or a very careful lie, and that I have not yet found the honest explanation, though I have looked for one, because I did not wish to bring you a suspicion dressed as a certainty." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face eased, fractionally, the way a man's shoulders ease when a weight he has been carrying alone is, for the first time, shared rather than merely witnessed. You looked for the honest explanation first. Always, a figure deserves that much before it is condemned. "My father used to say something very like it," he said, and there was a roughness under the words that had not been there before, that a man ought to be given the same courtesy as a column of numbers, added up fairly before he is judged, and never judged on the strength of one bad line alone. He turned the signet ring once around his finger, a small, private motion she was coming to recognize as the shape his composure took when it was costing him something to keep it. "I have not been a very diligent steward of his diligence, Miss Hartley. I inherited this house at 24 with a father 8 months in his grave, and a cousin I trusted because my father trusted him, and I confess I have signed papers I ought to have read twice. You are reading them now." "I am reading them now," he agreed, "because you have made it rather difficult not to." He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register she had not heard from him before. Careful, the way a man is careful crossing ice he does not entirely trust. "There is a debt I carry, Miss Hartley, that I have not yet found the courage to lay before anyone in this house, my aunt least of all. It touches on Thomas Fenn, and on why I ride out most mornings before the household wakes, and it is not the debt the kitchen has decided upon, though I confess I have not troubled myself overmuch to correct them." He stopped there, visibly, the way a man stops at the edge of a step he cannot yet see the bottom of. I am not ready to tell it whole. I ask you to trust that when I am, you will be the first to hear it entire, and not merely the part the household has already invented for its own amusement. I have never needed the whole of a thing to trust the part that is offered honestly," said Eleanor, and meant it, though she felt the withheld half of his sentence sitting between them like an unlit candle. Waiting for a flame neither of them was yet prepared to strike, he looked at her as though she had given him something rather larger than the sentence deserved, and for the second time that fortnight, the almost laugh reached all the way to his eyes, and this time did not retreat before it arrived, a short, surprised huff of breath that transformed his whole grave face for the length of 2 heartbeats into something almost boyish. She marked that, too, the way she marked figures, exactly and without meaning to, and thought, "That is the first time I have heard him laugh," and was faintly ashamed of how much the thought pleased her. The blow, when it came dressed as an ordinary Tuesday. Lady Iris had invited Miss Verity Langham and her mother to dine, a courtesy everyone in the house understood to be the opening move of a match Lady Iris had been quietly engineering since spring, Miss Langham being handsome, well-dowered, and possessed of a father eager to see his daughter a duchess before the year was out. Eleanor had been asked to have the household accounts in order for Lady Iris's inspection before the guests arrived, a request that seemed, at the time, entirely without malice. It was Coldbrook who brought the folded letter into the drawing-room, not troubling to knock, his face arranged into an expression of profound and reluctant sorrow that fit him the way a borrowed coat fits a man who has practiced the gesture of wearing it. "Forgive the intrusion. I would not have brought this before company were I not certain his grace would wish it settled rather than left to fester as rumor." He laid the letter on the table before Lady Iris, and Eleanor, standing near the sideboard with a tray she had not yet set down, felt the whole room's attention pivot toward it like a compass finding north. "It is a note of payment, in his Grace's own hand, made out to a Mrs. R. Fenn, quarterly, for these 2 years past. I found it filed among the estate correspondence and confess I did not know what to make of it, until I recalled that Mrs. Fenn is the very woman kept at the cottage past Hollow Beck, the one his Grace visits before the household wakes." Lady Iris read it. Miss Langham read it over her shoulder, her handsome face arranging itself into a careful, wounded blankness. Julian, entering the room at that precise moment with the timing of a man walking into a trap he had not known was laid, stopped in the doorway and read the room before he read the letter, which was, Eleanor thought later, the single most telling thing he could have done, because a guilty man reads the paper first. "That is my hand," he said when the letter reached him, "and that is my signature, and I will not insult anyone in this room by pretending otherwise." "Then, you admit," began Lady Iris. "I admit I have paid a pension to Thomas Fenn's widow these 2 years, out of a debt I have not yet explained to you, Aunt, because the explaining touches on matters I am not yet free to lay before this company." His jaw was very tight, the ring turning once, twice, beneath his fingers. "I will not defend myself against an accusation no one has yet had the honesty to make plainly." "No one need make it plainly, Your Grace," said Coldbrook gently. Gently. The way a man drives a nail gently so that the wood will not split before it is deep enough to hold. The figures make it for us. And here he turned, with the same terrible gentleness, to Eleanor. "Miss Hartley has been keeping the household accounts this fortnight past. Perhaps she can tell us whether such a payment appears reconciled anywhere in the books she has so diligently reviewed, or whether it has been kept, as I rather fear, entirely apart from any ledger a trustee might think to examine." Every face in the room turned to her. She felt, with a clarity that frightened her more than the accusation itself, the trap closing on 2 throats at once, his and her own, because whatever she said next would be read as either a confession of concealment or a defense that would look, to everyone watching, exactly like love finding excuses for the man who inspired it. "I found no such entry," she said, and her voice, to her own relief, did not shake. "Which is not proof of innocence, Miss Coldbrook, only proof of an absence, and an absence proves nothing at all, except that someone has not yet looked in the right ledger." "How very convenient," said Coldbrook, "that the ledger in question should be the one you have not yet been shown." It was said so lightly, so regretfully, that it took Eleanor a full second to understand she had just been called, before Lady Iris and a woman being courted as the next Duchess, either a fool or a conspirator, and that Coldbrook had arranged matters so that whichever she was taken for, the Duke's reputation bled either way. The quarrel came that same night, in the study, with the fire dead and neither of them troubling to light it again. "You should not have answered him," Julian said, pacing in a way she had never seen him pace, all his careful stillness burned away. "You should have said nothing at all and let it fall on me, where it belongs. It does not belong to you alone, Your Grace, whatever you have decided in the last hour to believe. I am the one who has been handling the accounts. If there is a conspiracy to be suspected of, I am already in it, whether I speak or hold my tongue." "Then hold your tongue," he said, sharper than she had ever heard him, "and let me manage what I ought to have managed alone from the start. I should never have brought you into this house's business. It was selfish of me, and I see that now, and I will not compound the selfishness by letting you be ruined alongside me for a debt that is mine and no one else's to carry. You did not bring me into your business, Your Grace. I walked into it the moment I opened your first ledger, and I have not once asked you to protect me from the consequence of my own competence." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the word competence, and she hated it, hated that he should see the crack. "You wish to carry this alone because you have decided, somewhere in that grave and stubborn head of yours, that I am a thing to be spared rather than a person entitled to choose her own risks. That is not protection, Your Grace. That is merely a more courteous cruelty." He stopped pacing. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the rain returning to the windows, and somewhere beyond it, faint and out of season, the single sweet interrogative note of a lark disturbed too early from its roost. "I cannot lose anyone else to this," he said, very low, "on the strength of a secret I was too proud, or too afraid, to tell in time." "Then tell it," said Eleanor. "Not to spare me, to stop carrying it alone." He looked at her as though the offer cost him something to refuse, and refused it anyway, and she left the study that night with the unlit candle of his half-confession still standing unstruck between them, and a colder certainty than before that whatever he was protecting her from, he intended to go on protecting her from it directly into ruin. Coldbrook came to her 2 mornings later, in the small, sunlit parlor where she took her mending, and set down beside her a small leather purse that made a sound, settling, of coin rather than thread. "I have taken the liberty," he said, "of speaking to my cousin's aunt about your situation, Miss Hartley, and she is not unsympathetic to the notion that a young woman in your position might wish to remove herself quietly from a household about to become rather more scrutinized than is comfortable for anyone attached to it. There is a position, I am told, in Bath, respectable, well paid, and entirely free of the difficulties currently attaching themselves to this address. All that is required of you is a short statement, for the trustee's benefit, confirming that the accounts you reviewed showed signs of concealment consistent with what the household has already, regrettably, come to suspect. You are asking me to say that His Grace hid a mistress's pension in his books. I am asking you to say what is, in substance, already believed by every soul in 3 parishes, and to be very comfortably paid for the saying of it." He smiled his close, contained smile. "It costs you nothing, Miss Hartley, that has not already been spent by gossip on your behalf." She looked at the purse for a long moment, long enough that she saw the confidence in his face begin, very slightly, to sharpen into something more watchful, and then she set her mending down, corner folded precisely over corner, the way her father had taught her to leave any work she meant to return to with a clear conscience. "I have never once, in my life, managed to tell a comfortable lie, Mr. Coldbrook. I do not intend to begin for the price of a purse I have not even troubled to count." "You will regret this, Miss Hartley." "Perhaps," she said. "But I shall regret it honestly, which is more than I can say for the alternative you have offered me." He took up the purse without another word, and the cold, clean smell of starch and lavender water lingered in the parlor a full minute after he had gone, and Eleanor sat very still in its wake, aware that she had just refused the only exit that would have cost her nothing, and that the door now closing behind Coldbrook's retreating figure was very likely the door to her position in that house as, well, it closed 3 days later, and it closed, as such doors so often do, with an apology attached to soften nothing at all. Lady Iris received her in the small morning room, with her hands folded and her eyes not quite meeting Eleanor's, which told Eleanor everything before a single word was spoken. "You understand, Miss Hartley, that this reflects no judgment upon your character. I understand that you have been persuaded it must appear to, whatever you privately believe." "The trustees sit in a fortnight," said Lady Iris, and for a moment something almost apologetic moved behind the practiced composure. "I cannot have it said that the household accounts were kept, even in part, by a young woman whose own position here has become the subject of quite so much talk. It is not fair to you. It is not fair to my nephew. It is, I am afraid, simply necessary." Eleanor did not argue. She had learned, across a childhood spent watching her father argue a case that ruined him regardless of the arguing, that necessity dressed in an apologetic voice was no less immovable than necessity dressed in a cruel one. She packed what little she owned into the same trunk she had arrived with 3 years before, and she left Alderley Hall on a gray morning, with Mrs. Pruitt pressing a parcel of bread and cheese into her hands at the servant's door, and saying nothing at all, because there are kindnesses too large for a housekeeper to trust her own voice with. She did not see Julian before she left. She told herself this did not matter, and knew, walking down the long drive with the trunk growing heavier by the mile, that it mattered a very great deal. What she did not know, what no one at Alderley Hall yet knew, was that the cottage at Hollowbeck stood empty that same morning, its hearth cold, its door unlatched, a child's shoe left forgotten beneath the window seat, and that the carriage which had carried Rebecca Fenn and her son away from it had left, unremarked by anyone who thought to mention it to the one man who rode there every week, believing he alone carried the whole weight of that small, guarded household's safety. He would ride out the next dawn as he always did, and find the door standing open on an empty room, and no one. Not the gossiping kitchen, not his aunt, not the man who had engineered the departure, would think, until it was very nearly too late, to tell him where they had gone, or why, or what it might mean that a woman he had sworn to protect had vanished from his protection on the very morning his reputation for keeping her had finally, publicly, caught fire. He searched for 3 days before he thought to send for Eleanor, and he did not send a servant to fetch her. He came himself, on a hired horse, to the small rooms in the village of Cressel, where she had taken lodging with a cousin of her mother's, and he stood in the doorway with 3 days' searching written plainly on a face that had forgotten, for once, how to arrange itself into stillness. "She is gone," he said, without preamble, without even the courtesy of a greeting, because a man 3 days into terror has very little courtesy left to spend. Rebecca Fenn. The cottage. Everything, her clothes, the boy's things, the ledger her husband kept, all of it gone before dawn on the very morning I was made to look a liar before my own aunt. And I cannot find a soul in 3 parishes who will tell me where, or who arranged the carriage that took them, though someone must have, because Rebecca Fenn has not owned a carriage of her own in all the years I have known her. You believe Coldbrook arranged it? I believe, he said, and his voice broke, finally, on the word that I have spent 2 years protecting that woman and her son from a danger I did not fully understand myself, out of guilt for a shooting accident I ordered closed before it was properly investigated. Because Coldbrook told me it was accident, and I, God forgive me, wished very much to believe him. And I believe that if any harm has come to them, because I was too proud to tell anyone, including you, the whole of what I was protecting them from, then I have no one to blame for it but my own stubborn silence. He looked at her as a drowning man looks at the one rope within reach. I do not ask you to forgive me for sending you away. I ask you to help me find them before it is too late to matter that I finally worked up the courage to ask. The rain had begun again, soft against the window, and somewhere in the wet garden below a bird she could not see gave one uncertain, testing note before falling silent, as though even the lark had decided the hour was not yet safe for singing. She did not make him beg twice. She fetched her shawl, and her father's old ledger box, empty now, but for a stub of pencil, and a habit she had never broken of carrying it wherever she went, and she was halfway down the stair when a small, breathless figure appeared at the cousin's front door, no more than 9 years old, soaked through, clutching to his narrow chest a bundle wrapped in oilcloth as though his life depended on keeping it dry. "Are you Miss Hartley?" the boy asked, teeth chattering. "Mother said find Miss Hartley, the one from the big house who was kind to me at the fair, and give her this, and no one else, not even the Duke, not till she says it's safe." "I am Miss Hartley," said Eleanor, kneeling at once, heedless of her skirts on the wet step. "Where is your mother, Davy? Is she safe?" "Hiding," said Davy Fenn, and thrust the oilcloth bundle into her hands with the fierce relief of a boy setting down a weight he had carried much too far. "Mr. Coldbrook's men came to the cottage at dawn, and Mother said we had to go that very hour, and she said if anything happened to her before she could bring it herself, I was to find you, because you'd know what to do with Father's book. And I was not to trust it to any vein at all until you said so, not even a kind one." Behind her, in the doorway, Julian went very still. In the particular way she had come to know meant a blow had landed somewhere too deep for his face to show it plainly, and Eleanor, looking down at the water-swollen oilcloth in her hands, understood that she was holding, at last, the whole and honest reconciliation of every figure that had refused, until this moment, to balance. She opened the bundle at the kitchen table of her mother's cousin's house, with Julian standing so close behind her chair she could feel the damp wool of his coat, and Davy Fenn wrapped in a blanket and fed hot broth by a woman who asked no questions because Eleanor's face had told her not to. The book within was small, worn, bound in cracked leather gone soft at the corners, and its first pages held nothing more sinister than a gamekeeper's ordinary business. Vermin counted, coverts walked, pheasant eggs marked against poachers, in a plain, careful hand that Eleanor recognized at once as the hand behind the torn coppice entry she had found weeks before. Not Coldbrook's own writing, but writing done at his direction, or under his eye. By a man who had known exactly what he was being made to falsify, and had kept, in secret, on the very last pages of his own private ledger, an honest second account of everything he had been forced to hide. There were dates, there were sums, matched precisely against the false ones Eleanor had already found, each pair of figures a small, damning twin. And on the final written page, in a hand grown unsteady, as though written in haste or in fear or both, there was an entry dated the morning of Thomas Fenn's death, recording not a tally of birds, but a conversation, word for careful word, in which a man identified only as SC had promised Fenn that his silence about the timber sales would be worth a very great deal to his family, and that his continued honesty would be worth considerably less than his own safety. Beneath it, in the same failing hand, one final line: "If I am found dead upon this land, let it be known I was not careless with a gun I have carried steady for 20 years. He knew, Julian said, very quietly, into the silence that followed her reading it aloud. He knew Coldbrook meant to see him silenced, and he wrote it down anyway, and I closed the inquiry in 3 days because Coldbrook told me the coroner had seen enough, and I believed him because it was easier than grieving a man twice." "Then, let us make certain," said Eleanor, closing the ledger with both hands, gently, the way one closes a door on a room too long left dark, "that his honesty was not wasted a second time." Somewhere above the rain, faint and returning, the lark began again, steadier now, as though it too had decided the worst of the storm had passed. The trustees sat for the Michaelmas audit on a bright, washed morning 10 days later, in the long gallery at Alderley Hall, with the ball that was to follow it already half decorated around the edges of the room, garlands hung, and chairs not yet arranged, so that the reckoning and the celebration stood, absurdly, side by side, waiting to see which the day would prove to be. Mr. Prior, the trustee's solicitor, a dry, precise man with spectacles perpetually sliding down a long nose, sat at the head of the table with the estate's books before him. Lady Iris sat at his right hand, Miss Langham and her mother among the assembled witnesses at the room's edge, drawn by curiosity or by loyalty, or, in Miss Langham's case, by something that looked very like relief at the prospect of a truth arriving before she was obliged to marry into whatever lay beneath the rumor. Coldbrook stood near the window, composed, his cravat pin catching the light, and beside him, pale and sweating despite the coolness of the morning, stood his clerk, Mr. Hollis, a thin, nervous man who had not, Eleanor noted, met anyone's eye since entering the room. Julian opened the proceedings himself, standing rather than sitting, the ring turned once around his finger, and then still. "I have asked Miss Hartley to present certain findings," he said, "regarding discrepancies in the estate's timber accounts, discovered in the course of the review I myself commissioned. I would ask that she be heard in full before any judgment is formed." Coldbrook's composure did not crack, not yet, but something in his stillness sharpened. The way a cat sharpens before it is entirely certain it means to run. Eleanor rose and laid Thomas Fenn's ledger upon the table, opened to the paired columns she had marked with slips of paper, and read the sums aloud, one against the other. False against true, until the room had heard, in the plainest arithmetic imaginable, 11 years of timber sold twice over, once honestly and once into a private account Mr. Prior's own inquiries, made discreetly in the preceding week at Julian's request, had already traced to a bank in a neighboring county under a name that was not quite Coldbrook's own, but very nearly. "A clerical irregularity," said Coldbrook, and his voice, for the first time, had lost a fraction of its practiced ease, "is not proof of theft, still less of anything worse. Ledgers are kept by many hands. I cannot answer for every entry made under my roof." "You can answer for this one," said Eleanor, and turned to the ledger's final written page, and read Thomas Fenn's last entry aloud into a silence so complete she could hear the garlanded chairs creak faintly in the draught from the tall windows. She read the initials. She read the promise, and the threat beneath the promise. She read the line about the gun he had carried steady for 20 years and watched, as she read it, Mr. Hollis's face go the color of tallow. "Mr. Hollis," said Julian, quietly, turning to the clerk directly, "you entered the false sums in this ledger. In your own hand, did you not, at Mr. Coldbrook's instruction, in the weeks following Thomas Fenn's death?" Hollis opened his mouth and closed it, and looked once, briefly, at Coldbrook, whose face had arranged itself into an expression of patient, wounded confidence that asked, wordlessly, for loyalty one final time. It was not loyalty that broke him. It was the ledger itself, lying open on the table, Fenn's own careful, honest hand a rebuke to 11 years of Hollis's dishonest one. "He told me it was only figures," Hollis said, and his voice cracked on the word figures the way Eleanor's own had cracked, weeks before, on the word competence. "He told me no one troubled themselves over timber, that it was a small thing, a private arrangement, and I needed the position badly enough not to ask what a small thing was buying." I did not know about Fenn. Not then. I swear before God I did not know until it was already done, and by then I was in too deep to speak, because speaking would have hanged me alongside him. "It would not have hanged you," said Mr. Pryor dryly over his spectacles, "though it may yet see you dismissed without character, which I dare say feels very nearly the same this morning." He turned to Coldbrook. "Have you an answer, sir, to a dead man's own testimony written in his own hand on the very morning of his death?" Coldbrook was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, something in his voice had changed, the gentleness gone thin and brittle rather than smooth. "My father was the elder son," he said, to no one in particular, to the room at large, to the garlands hanging half-finished above their heads. "Did any of you know that? Elder by 4 years, and disinherited for a marriage the old Duke's father disliked, so that everything, the title, the house, the very ring that boy turns on his finger when he thinks no one is watching, came to a younger brother's line instead of mine. By an accident of paper no more honest than anything I have done since. I grew up watching my cousin inherit a world I had been taught, since the cradle, ought to have been mine, and I confess I stopped, somewhere along the way, believing that what I took back from it in small, careful sums was theft at all. It felt, God help me, very like repayment." His hand went, then, not to the cravat pin, but past it, to something beneath his collar Eleanor had never seen him touch before, a small, worn coin on a cord, and for one unguarded moment his face was not the face of a villain caught, but of a son still grieving a father's exile 40 years gone. "I did not mean for Fenn to die. I meant only to frighten him into silence. The gun was not meant to be more than an accident that would look, conveniently, like carelessness. I have not slept an honest night since, whatever else you may believe of me." The room held its breath. Julian's jaw was very tight, the ring stilled entirely now beneath his fingers, and when he spoke his voice carried none of the triumph the moment might have licensed, and all of the weariness a man carries after setting down, at last a stone he has held too long. "I could see you tried for what you have just confessed before this whole room, cousin, and I could see you tried for what you did before, and I have, I think, every right the law allows me to do so." He paused. "I find I have no wish to. My father taught me that a man is owed the same courtesy as a column of figures, added fairly before he is condemned, and you have just added your own sum honestly, for once, before witnesses, which is more honesty than you gave Thomas Fenn in the whole of his life. I will not see you hanged for a threat that became worse than you intended. I will see you gone from this county within the week, on a modest allowance sufficient to keep you from want and insufficient to keep you comfortable. And you will not, so long as I hold this title, set foot on land that borders Rebecca Fenn's or her son's again. This is not mercy for your sake, cousin. It is mercy for hers, and for mine, because I find I would rather live the rest of my life having been generous once too often than cruel a single time to a man already ruined by his own hand. Coldbrook said nothing. He touched the worn coin at his throat once more, and bowed very slightly to the room, and walked out through the tall doors into the bright-washed morning, and no one in that gallery, Eleanor thought, watching him go, would ever again mistake his gentleness for safety, though several of them, she suspected, would go on pitying him regardless, which was, perhaps, exactly the mercy Julian had intended to extend. It was Mrs. Pruitt who found Rebecca Fenn and Davy within the week, safely lodged with a sister in the next county, and it was Julian himself who rode out to bring them home, this time in broad daylight, with no need of secrecy at all, and it was on the evening of their return, with the ball's garlands finally hung in earnest and the whole household turned out in its best in celebration of a scandal resolved, rather than confirmed, that he found Eleanor alone on the terrace, the last of the light going gold and soft across the lawn, a lark singing somewhere in the last warmth of the day, as though it had never once stopped to consider the danger of an early hour. "I owe you a whole confession," he said, "which I believe I promised you some weeks ago and never finished paying. You owe me nothing, Your Grace. The debt was settled this morning, before witnesses, in the proper coin. Not that debt." He turned the ring once, and then, deliberately, stopped, and let his hand fall still and open at his side. "I do not spend where I do not intend to pay in full, Miss Hartley. You said something very like it to me once, of your father's, about figures, that the books always balance, in the end. I have thought of little else these 3 days but what I owe you, and how poorly a purse or a position would settle it, and I find I have arrived at only one sum that does the account justice." He held out his hand, not the ring but the hand itself, open, unhurried, the way he had first stood in her still-room doorway weeks before. "Marry me because you wish it, Eleanor, not because I am grateful, though I am, more than I know how to say. Not because it would settle any scandal, for the scandal is already settled without your help. I ask you for no reason but the one that has nothing at all to do with what either of us is owed, which is that I have not laughed, truly laughed, since before my father died, until the evening you told me you had never once managed a comfortable lie, and I find I would like to spend the rest of my life in the company of someone who will go on being that inconvenient for me." "That is a very poor proposal, Your Grace," said Eleanor, though her voice was not steady, and her eyes were bright in the last of the gold light. "You have offered me no settlement, no figures, no account of what I am to gain by it. I have offered you the only sum I have that was never anyone's but mine to give," he said. "Everything else, I find, was always already yours." She laughed then, the sound startled out of her, and it was answer enough for both of them, and when she said yes, it was in a voice gone thick with more feeling than a well-kept ledger ought to admit to holding. They were married quietly, in the small stone chapel at Alderley, rather than the cathedral in the county town Lady Iris had first proposed, with Mrs. Pruitt weeping without shame into a handkerchief she had clearly brought for the purpose, and Davy Fenn, scrubbed pink and solemn in a borrowed coat, carrying the ring on a cushion he handled as though it were made of glass. Rebecca Fenn and her son were given the cottage at Hollowbeck outright, deed and all, with an income settled on them that owed nothing now to secrecy or guilt, only to gratitude honestly spent. In time Davy was apprenticed to Mr. Pryor's own office, where a boy with his father's careful hand for figures was found, everyone agreed, to have a natural gift for reconciling accounts that would not lie still. Mr. Hollis was dismissed without character, as Mr. Pryor had promised, but Julian, unable in the end to leave even a frightened man entirely without a floor beneath him, wrote him a private letter of introduction to a mill owner 2 counties distant who had need of a clerk, and no particular need of a spotless history. Miss Langham, freed of an engagement no one had ever quite made official, married within the year a baronet of modest fortune and considerable good humor, and sent Eleanor, unprompted, a letter that said only that she was glad. In the end, the truth had chosen to be plain rather than comfortable, and that she hoped Eleanor would forgive her for having once believed, however briefly. The comfortable version instead. Of Simon Coldbrook there was only, once a year, a letter from the coast of France, brief, correct, unrepentant of nothing but the manner of his failure, which Julian read each time in silence and answered each time in the same 3 sentences, and which Eleanor came, over the years, to understand as the last small entry in a very long and very human account. Neither forgiven nor forgotten, only, at last, closed. It was a year almost to the day, in the first cool gold of the following autumn, that the village of Cressel again watched a rider come home in the gray hour before the sun found the chimneys, mud to the knees, collar loosened, though this time there were 2 riders rather than 1, and the errand that had taken them out before dawn was no secret kept from anyone at all. Only a visit paid together to a widow, and her son who had long since stopped needing to be visited in secret and had simply, over the year, become friends. Patience, grown a little wiser and considerably more careful of her tongue, watched them pass from the scullery window and said only, to no one in particular, that it did a body good to see his Grace laughing so easily of a morning. And did not trouble this time to invent a story to explain it, because the true one, once it had finally been let out into the daylight, had turned out to be so very much better than anything gossip had managed to dream up in its place. Eleanor, riding beside her husband with the lark singing somewhere above the hedgerow, and the whole gold morning opening out ahead of them like a ledger with every column, at long last, reconciled, thought of her father, and of Thomas Fenn, and of every quiet, honest hand that had ever kept an account faithfully, and been doubted for it anyway, and said, mostly to herself, the old inherited words that had carried her through every dark column of that long, strange year. The books always balance in the end. Julian, catching the words on the wind, reached over and took her hand, and did not need to ask what she meant by them, because by then he had come, at considerable cost and no small mercy, to believe it every bit as much as she did. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the quiet one, doing the honest counting while the room decided its verdict without you, then pull your chair a little closer to the fire, because there is kettle enough and warmth enough here for one more. I would love to know which line stayed with you longest, the promise Julian would not spend where he did not mean to pay in full, or Eleanor's steady, stubborn refusal to tell a comfortable lie, even when it would have cost her nothing to tell one. Tell me in the comments, and while you are there, keep your seat by the hearth, subscribe, so you never miss the next fire we light together. Until then, sleep well, and be gentle with the quiet ones, keeping your accounts honest when no one else thinks to look.